Many historical weapons are wonderfully light and nimble. And while there are lots of urban myths around, such as how heavy medieval swords are, which they really aren't, we shouldn't propagate the myth that all historical weapons are light, because some of them are really overbuilt and quite heavy. And in this video, we're going to look at why, covering specific examples of polearms, industrial period cavalry swords, certain types of big and heavy shields, military rifles and muskets, even including in the modern era as well, and also certain types of large and heavy helmets. So come with me to look through the context of why some of these historical arms and armour are really quite heavy. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and the first thing I want to say before I dive into this video is I've reached 500,000 subscribers. It means a massive amount to me. I've been doing this for a long time, so to reach that 500k mark is really cool to me. So thank you to everyone who has subscribed. If you're not subscribed, then please think about doing so, because it really helps the channel. And also massive thanks to my Patreon patrons. So in this video we're going to look at why specific items, and I've picked some quite, famous and important military items from across the centuries, from the ancient world really to the 19th century. You could even say the 20th, 21st century in one case, which you'll see in a minute. And why are some of them seemingly heavier than maybe they need to be? Or more specifically, why are some examples really heavy as opposed to the other lighter examples? And we're going to talk about that. Now, I couldn't give a catch-all answer to this when I started to try to, because in fact there's specific examples, and clearly the reasons why you might have something like this great bassinet, or grand bassinet as it's sometimes known, is a really big heavy helmet. We'll get to that in due course. The reasons why that is big and heavy are obviously going to be somewhat different to the reasons that a musket and bayonet is big and heavy. But do you know what, when I started going through these, there's actually some common themes, and we'll see those as we go along. So the first example we're going to look at is medieval polearms, that is, or shafted, hafted weapons as some people prefer to call them. I like the word polearm personally, I don't see a problem with it. But anyway, essentially weapons that are on a long stick. Now these became, well, they were popular right the way through the medieval period, but they became particularly important in the period of armour. So you might therefore think that the obvious answer I'm going to give is armour, because you want them to be heavy to hit armour harder. And there is an element of that to it. There's no question that you can't make a poleaxe ludicrously light, because it would cease to be effective as a poleaxe. In fact, there are other weapons which weren't necessarily used against fully armoured knights, like the poleaxe was intended to be used. Things more like the bill and the glaive and the partisan, and some of those are quite light, but overall they are still quite heavy. So there's actually, apart from armour, there's a couple of other reasons why that should be the case. Firstly, it's simply to do with their size. It seems really simple, but there it is. If you make a weapon really large, even if it's a pike, you're not bashing someone with a pike, you're poking them. But because it's so large, it's inevitably going to be weighty. And moreover, if we made it too light, it would cease to be, and this is the second really important part, and I would say actually one of the most important parts, durability. Okay, so when we're talking about something like swords, we'll get to swords more fully in a second, but when we're talking with something about swords, there is clearly a weight parameters, an upper and lower limit for something of that size. But when we make something which is needfully much larger, we get leverage involved, which you simply don't get. The forces you get involved with things like poleaxes and halberds and bills and glaives are way bigger than the forces with swords or daggers or short swords or whatever. So clearly one part of that is that's what makes them effective against armour. The fact that they can move with so much more leverage and momentum, and they can hit with a lot more energy. Okay, but what often people think about, forget about rather, is they think about hitting the armour and think, wow, it's brilliant, we're going to put a really heavy head on this thing and a really long shaft, and when we hit that person in the head, it's going to hit with so much energy. But they forget Newtonian physics, and the fact is that when you hit a large, solid, relatively heavy object like a man in armour or a horse, a lot of energy comes back into this weapon. So I have talked about this in specific poleaxe videos in the past. But if we look at this poleaxe as an example, but you could apply it to halberds or various other things, you will notice it has languettes along here. And that is really primarily, some people go, oh, it's to stop someone lopping off the head of the weapon. Yes, a little bit to protect the shaft, but actually experimentation has shown this is largely to keep the weapon together. When you're bashing someone in armour, they're not a squishy body anymore, they're a big armoured heavy object. And when you're hitting something really hard, or indeed if the opponent parries, so say for example someone's swinging a weapon at me, bam, and I put my weapon in the way, there are enormous forces going through here, and that's true of all pole weapons. And of course, because they are top heavy weapons, the amount of inertia in that head wants to keep on travelling. So if you suddenly stop it here, you need something to hold the weapon together. So without going on too much more detail, because we've got plenty of other things to cover, pole arms, they are big. You want them to hit harder. You can manage them being heavier because you've got your hands further apart on the shaft, unlike on a two-handed sword, for example. But most importantly, I would say almost, they need to be more durable because they are bigger, because the leverage involved is so great. You have to overbuild them, and this is a theme we're going to come back to repeatedly with other weapons here. You have to overbuild them purely for them to survive that style of combat. So next up are cavalry troopers' swords. That is regimentally owned, so government purchased, government produced cavalry swords as used in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. Now, some of you might be thinking, what on earth is Matt talking about here? These aren't heavy weapons, but here's the thing. They are, in general, heavier than the officer's versions, and there's a very big difference. So here's an officer's sword. So there's a few things which give away an officer's sword, usually things like a decorated blade, but one of the other things is they tend to be, they're not always, it's not a universal rule, but they tend to be, if you're comparing like with for the same type of regiment in the same period and the same type of cavalry, then they tend to be lighter than the troopers' versions, okay? Well, why is that? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, the officer's weapon is private purchase, okay? So if you're an officer, so lieutenant, captain, major, whatever, you have to buy all of your own equipment in this period. So you go out and you buy, you know, an expensive item. Imagine you're buying your own mobile phone, cell phone, or your own vehicle, your own car, compared to one being provided for you by the state, by the government, by the police, or whoever you work for. And that's the equivalent of these. These are state produced for private soldiers, okay, for the rank and file. So very different criteria. So why are these heavier? And they are in general heavier. Why are they heavier? So fundamentally, the biggest and most important reason goes back to the poleaxe over there, durability. If you are the government, and rather than being a private individual going out and buying your own item, which you want to be as light and nimble and beautifully made as possible, if you're a government contractor, you're there to procure for the state, you want as many swords for the best price that won't break and bend and that will get the job done, okay, as possible. So number one, you're going to buy durable products, and you therefore, on average, want them to be slightly overbuilt. But there is another factor as well, and this is why I specifically picked on cavalry swords. So cavalry swords, as opposed to infantry swords, come under a lot more stress. If you're riding along on a horse at 15, 20, 30 miles an hour and you're hitting an opponent or hitting a target of some kind with a cavalry sword, it needs to be fairly robust. And not only that, but because it's a regimental weapon, not only do you want it to be strong enough to do that on one campaign, but potentially you want it to be able to last through multiple campaigns and across years. In many cases, these regimental weapons, let's say one was purchased by the regiment in 1822, you still find them being owned by the regiment and carried by successive troopers throughout their careers up until, let's say, the 1850s. So in some cases, these swords are in use and taken on multiple campaigns. They need to be strong and tough, and that also goes through to the scabbards as well. So both the swords and the scabbards of these cavalry troopers' weapons are, generally speaking, overbuilt, partly for economic reasons, partly for just durability because you don't want them failing on the cavalry troopers, and partly because cavalry on horses hit things quite hard because horses move at speed. Now, next up, a completely different type of weapon, and that is shields. Now, obviously shields have been used pretty much throughout human history. Obviously they must have been invented at some point, but we don't know when the earliest shields appeared, way back in prehistory. And shields have enormous variety. There are light shields, there are heavy shields, there are big shields, there are small shields, okay? We'll talk about lighter shields in a second. But it's without a shadow of a doubt that some shields in history, and this is a replica of a Roman scutum, but there are other examples, for example, the pavis, or pavis, depending on how you pronounce it, from the late medieval period and early Renaissance, that are big, heavy shields. So why are these shields specifically so heavy? One reason is the durability issue that we've already looked at with cavalry swords and poleaxes for slightly different reasons, but durability of shields. So if you consider this specifically, the Roman scutum, this is a shield which a Roman legionary has to take on campaign. The Roman legions were famous for marching huge distances, building a camp and a fortified encampment that night, camping, and then marching on again and building another encampment. So their equipment had to be tough and robust. If you're marching into enemy territory and you're covering large distances, you can't be dealing with shields which might become damaged by just being carried on backs, or by being used in combat, or being leant up against things while you're busy digging trenches. You need this object to be really tough for campaigning use. But there's another reason why these shields are also heavy, apart from the fact that they're big. And obviously we have to say that obviously the bigger a shield is, the heavier it gets. But it is the way that these shields were used specifically by the Romans. So actually not all Roman shields are that heavy. The later period, more oval shields, it seems they are more nimble, they are smaller shields, more akin to the migration era or Viking era shields that we see later on. And we'll come back to that in a second, those lighter shields. But the Roman legions used their shields in very particular ways. And one of those is forming essentially a block of people with shields that is quite almost like a mobile fortification. So these things are held close to the body, relatively close to the body, and interlinked with others. And you wouldn't want these being too light and flimsy because they wouldn't stand up to that type of battle formation. Now, another important factor is archery. Not that the Romans made particular use of archers. At various points they did have auxiliary archers and archers from specific regions, but by and large the Roman war machine didn't really depend on archers. Moreover, they often had to fight against nations who did use lots of archers. So these shields, being partly like a mobile fortification, also have to stand up to being hit by multiple arrows. Now the problem with arrows is arrows can go through shields if they're not thickly built enough. But the second problem is if you're on campaign as the Roman army and not being able to necessarily replace huge numbers of shields, the problem is even if you don't come into close combat with the enemy, and even in close combat, how many times does a shield get hit by another sword or a spear? Not that much. Whereas if people are shooting arrows at you, potentially these shields, these scutum, could be shot multiple times with arrows, and then you'd break the arrows off and pull the heads out and that kind of stuff, and still be on campaign. So even after receiving lots of arrow shots, whether it's from Germans or Britons or whoever else in the Middle East, these shields are going to be subjected to lots of missile fire, and not only arrows but also slingshots and javelins and stuff as well. So these potentially have to take lots of missile hits and still be useful as shields in close combat or in the next battle of the campaign, because you might not be able to replace them. Now, going to the medieval period, if we look at the pavis, it's a very similar thing, but you've got this added element of sometimes it's used as a static protection. So sometimes it's actually placed down on the ground and crossbowmen or gunners load their weapons behind it. And we also have specific siege versions or fortification versions, and these can be even heavier. So actually we have a range of weights. Sometimes we've got lighter, what are called hand pavises, and when we've got heavier ones, which are used more like a mobile fortification that you can hide behind and load behind. So there are certain types of shields in history, particularly the larger ones, generally speaking, because obviously size and weight often go hand in hand, but not always. I'll come to that in a second. that needs to be heavy and durable for the reasons explained. Now, I said that I'd mentioned the lighter shields. Now, it should be mentioned there are types of shields which are really big, which are also quite light. Viking era shields are pretty light, but of course, these were shields being used in really quite a different way to the Roman army was using the scutum, or the late medieval army was using a pavis. These aren't, generally speaking, stood up and used as any kind of fortification. They don't protect you in quite the same way as a Roman scutum because they don't cover as much of your body in length or width. And they don't even interact and interlock with, although you might have a shield wall, they don't work in the same way as a Roman testudo, for example. And these shields one-on-one seem to be used more extended out, so you can't make them too heavy. And yes, indeed, they were used in single combat as well, and we must say there seems to have been a greater emphasis on single combat in Germanic and Celtic cultures. But anyway, that's for another topic, another video, another time. So this very different type of shield, and there are big shields. Zulu shields are big, but incredibly light because they're made of hide. So we have to consider, what is the shield for? Who's it being used for? How long is it being used for? How long it is expected to survive? Viking shields in a duel, you could expect to go through several shields. And what type of weapons is it gonna face? Certain types of, if you're being shot at with crossbows, you need a really thick shield. If you're only dealing with people with stabbing spears, like the Zulus, then you don't need such a thick shield. So different shields used in different ways by different people at different times. So leaping forwards in time, quite a lot now, we come to muskets and rifles, and I'll keep this relatively brief. Quite simply, there are three main reasons why these are fairly heavy objects. And what do I mean by heavy? I'm going to use imperial measurements here because I'm British, and probably a lot of you out there are American. You can do the metric conversion. So muskets and rifles, whether we're talking about the 18th, 19th, or 20th centuries, it's just changing in recent years a bit, but most military firearms weigh between £8 and £11. And in the modern military world, ironically, we were moving towards lighter rifles. However, I noticed that some new rifles that have come out in America are getting heavy again, and the British SA-80, which is now being phased out of service, is also pretty heavy. But something like this, a musket, weighs about £9. That means that as a hand weapon, okay, with a bayonet on the end, you might think, well, it's just like a spear. No, it's not, because a spear weighs usually less than half that, and it's longer. So a spear gives you greater reach for a lot less weight. This is fundamentally heavy because it's a firearm. And so the first thing we have to mention is these are heavy, number one, because they have to function as a firearm. Okay? The second thing is connected to that. You want a certain amount of weight if you are shooting a heavy musket ball with a big charge behind it. You can make lighter guns, and we'll talk about those in a second. However, for absorbing recoil, a heavy weapon, if you're using a heavy charge and a large ball, is quite useful. But here's the third reason, and the one that I really want to focus on because it links in with the other weapons that we've looked at here. Durability again. So I said that I'd mention lighter firearms. Well, if you know anything about firearms, or you shoot maybe, you will see that the civilian versions of firearms, and this goes all the way back to the 16th, 17th century, the civilian version, so like the hunting version or the sporting version of firearms, are usually, if not always, they are usually lighter than the military version. Why? Well, sometimes it can be a matter of the caliber and the charge and things like that, but very often it's because military weapons have to be overbuilt. Why? Because private soldiers, aka squaddies, aren't very careful with their equipment, and for the same reason as I mentioned, to do with the cavalry sabres. These are government procured, government purchased, and the government, if you've got a brown bess, which was in use for decades in the 18th century and into the 19th century, a brown bess musket might be used for 30 years. You want it to last. And have you seen how soldiers treat their equipment? I was going to say guns, but just any equipment. They get thrown around. You might jump into a trench and bash it against the side of the trench. You might clear out a building and smash it into a doorway. You might drop it. You might be killed and drop it, and then they'll come and retrieve it and give it to another soldier. It gets thrown into the regimental armoury, it gets taken on parade. I can't actually put this on here because I don't have enough headroom for the bayonet, but it gets used on in drills, firing practice, everything else. So these things get absolutely brutalised in their military lives, and for that reason they are given long wooden stocks to protect the barrel from getting bent. All of the parts, like the cock as it's called, is much heavier and bigger and overbuilt compared to a sporting gun. The trigger pull is heavier and the trigger is thicker. Just everything about this is thicker and stronger because it's going to be used and abused by the soldiers. So the final thing we have in this video is helmets. Now obviously helmets come in a huge great variety across time and across places. And not all helmets are ludicrously heavy. In fact, some helmets are pretty light. But if you think about something like a modern helmet, like a builder's helmet or a bicycle helmet or something like this, they tend to be pretty light, don't they? Because you want people to not be discouraged from wearing them, and really they're to protect you from really incidental impacts. However, when we look at some of the heaviest helmets from history, like the great bassinet or the jousting helmet, they are clearly designed for heavy impacts. And in fact, so much so that both the great bassinet, you'll notice this strap here and a strap here, much the same as on a jousting helmet, that actually straps and buckles down to my breastplate and my backplate, just like a jousting helmet. This has got a different type of front on it to a jousting helmet, because this is primarily, if I put that heavy helmet down, and that is by far the heaviest helmet I've ever owned, that is supposed to keep you safe when people are hitting you with things like this. So this goes full circle. Many heavy helmets are heavy because they are there to protect you against the heaviest and most powerful weapons. On foot, the poleaxe, the halberd, the bill. On horseback, of course, the lance. But in addition to that, we also get heavy helmets, particularly as we get into the 16th and 17th centuries, that are designed to protect you from firearms. And sometimes helmets look far smaller and less protective than this. They might just protect the top of the head, but they are bulletproofed, and they were made extra thick, sometimes of layers, so that they could literally take a musket ball and the musket ball would bounce off. In fact, the Japanese used to buy those helmets and convert them into Japanese armours from the Spanish, Portuguese, English, Dutch and the other people they were trading with. So sometimes helmets are against hand weapons, lances, sometimes against missile weapons, crossbow bolts, arrows or bullets later on, and they are massively overbuilt. But there is another thing that people often don't think about. It's not just to prevent you against penetration. The weight actually protects your brain, okay? And the more inertia required to move this, the less likely your neck or your brain or other bits of your anatomy are going to get injured, because this is now far better at absorbing that huge impact from something like a two-handed swing from a poleaxe. So, number one, they are heavy because they're thick and they're big and they're protective. But number two, the weight itself also has a protective quality. And it must be said that some of the heaviest helmets are for these specific uses, for tournaments on foot or jousting on horseback, or for sieges where you're going to get shot at or get things dropped on you quite a lot more than you would in a typical battle. And battle helmets are often much lighter. So there we go. I've run through a range of different examples of why in history very often weapons have been overbuilt and made heavier than you might think they need to be for very specific and sometimes quite different and diverse reasons. Not always the same reasons, but as we saw, sometimes it is the same reasons, even when we're talking about something as varied as a musket or a rifle, all the way up to the modern day, things like the SA-80 or the, kind of other military rifles, the spear that's coming, things like this. Or durability going all the way back to regimental cavalry swords. A lot of the same considerations come in. Anyway, did you not think of any of these points? I'd be interested to see down below. And any other questions or specific weapons you'd like me to look at, you're very welcome again to ask down below in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.